introduce you Riccardo Lobato, that is a consultant specialized armed force, army, and conflict. He obtained a master degree with specialization in defense economics at the University of Brasilia. Then he works as an analyst for the Ministry of the Defense, and now he is the CEO and the analyst chief of the Equilibrio Consultoria. After his presentation, we will leave the floor to Fabrizio Mistio for the discussion of the presentation. He is the professor at the Department of Economics at the University Federal de Minas Gerais. Before he was professor for 10 years at the State University of Mato Grosso do Sul, and he published papers in high quality national and international journal.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to you all. If I may, I'm going to, as a professor, I rather always to be standing than sitting. So I would like to thank you, the presence of you all here today, dear friends of the academic community, the General, in the name of all the military here present, Mr. Ambassador, in the name of the diplomatic authorities here as well. What we're going to see today is a bit of a panorama of geopolitics focused, of course, in economics. But let me get to the point and you see what I'm exactly trying to mean. So, first of all, I will start with a brief introduction of the team. Then we're going for a bit of history. It's not possible to talk about geopolitics and economics in 2024 without speaking of the past 30 years of world history. Then we're going to see the world today and what to expect from tomorrow. And of course, we'll have some final considerations so that we can understand where's the world heading, especially what is intended, given that this is a seminary of developmentalist economics. So just two important remarks here today. The first is that these materials intended to be informative and that we do not have any political or ideological inclination. This is strictly for academic endings. I'd like to start with this phrase, Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon, from French as it is written here, a man who fight harder for his interest than for his rights. And this is exactly what geopolitics is about. It's about interests. It's not about the rights of people. I like to say always in equilibrium that in geopolitics there are no innocents. There are many victims, but there are no innocents in it. So, without further question, our introduction. Geopolitical economy or geoeconomy. There is a grammar discussion about these whole topics. Some will say that geopolitical economy is more Marxist than others. But in basic terms, the difference that we do have here is that geoeconomy focuses more on economy as the center of all world and man relations. What we are going to speak here today is geopolitical economy, meaning that economy is one of the fundamental bases of geopolitics, being it politics as it is, economy, society, and war, because war, Clausewitz would say, is the direct continuation of politics, but as we all see in these conflicted worlds that we live these days, is one of the things that humanity does the most. So it is intrinsic in our societies. So, who among you has not felt that our world has changed very quickly? I think that you all have seen that the world that you've grown is not the world of today. Even the younglings among you have seen that a decade ago, and what we see these days is something very different. So, why is it so? We need to go to the basis. And it's not the scene of a war, despite it looks like this is aftermath of an earthquake. This specific one is in Turkey, 2023. But you can see the similarities of it. And why is it so? Because the seismic movement that changes the earth and cause destruction can also be done in our society by ourselves. This is geopolitics. Whenever we have these quick changes, whenever we do have these moving forces coming on us, there are the cataclysms. And no one can see the consequences. We can trace how they started, but not how they are going to end. Therefore, what we can see as being the start of these all, of these three images that I will explain right in the sequel, and let's talk a bit of history. So we do have one of the most symbolic, the first one, from left to right, one of the most symbolic pictures of the Berlin Wall, a man clashing this physical division between East and West in 1989 in Germany. Then we have the second strike of the 9/11 attack in the United States. And the third one is the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, one of the oldest and theoretically one of the most solid institutions of the United States financial system. What do these all have in common? These events, separated by less than 3 decades apart, have shaped today's society. But let's see how exactly we got to here. By the end of the Cold War, we had the unipolar world and the end of history, as dared to call Francis Fukuyama in his so famous called book, The End of History. We all believed that by the early 1990s, we would get in an age of progress, where man would be friends with each other, and that we would have no further discussions. Everything would be dealt only in the negotiation table. But the Cold War left many sequels. One of them was exactly the first Iraq war, called the Gulf War, the first time where the United States power, now being the so multipolar power since the Soviet Union was basically extinct by that moment, triumphed. But the question is, did it so? Because there's a famous line in American politics that says the United States gained the war, but they lost the peace. And how this all started? Well, it started abroad with consequences at home. And these are the consequences. Each one of these pictures symbolizes an year: 1989, 1990, and 1991. First one, we've already spoken of it. By the end of the Cold War, Berlin Wall was just the climax of the thing. Movements that had been coming since the mid-80s in all the Eastern Bloc started with Mikhail Gorbachev's transformations of glasnost and perestroika, his renew economic and then political renew that didn't go along as he expected. And then we can see in the 1990 image that the Red Bloc had been dissoluted and there was left only the Soviet Union, no longer the satellite states of Central Europe. And then by the late 1991, and the Christmas of 1991 to be more specific, the Soviet Union finally collapsed. But we got there due to these two things. The first of them, the first picture shows a KGB office in front of the first McDonald's in Moscow, 1990. What is interesting to see here is that it was with still the Soviet Union standing. It would end only a bit more of a year later. And then we do have the KGB, these KGB offices that represents the apparatus, the repressive apparatus of the Red Bloc. He's posing in front of these McDonald's. But what does this picture symbolize? It symbolizes that economic changes of capitalism from the West were starting to get into the Soviet Russia back then. And so the system started to corrode itself by the inside. And the second thing is this image of Time magazine presenting President Ronald Reagan with his defending defense budget of the so-called Star Wars project. What was Star Wars about? Reagan, United States economy, to win the Soviet economy. What Reagan did was basically raw neoliberalism. He said he embraced the ideas of Milton Friedman, and he said, if we want to win the Soviets, we need to compete with them somewhere where they cannot compete on us. And where was it? Here we have the world military expenditure from 1950 to 2022. I want you to pay attention here, exactly 80 to 90. We can see that the United States have had a continuism here. They have had with the Iraq and Afghanistan wars here, they upgraded. There's some military expenditure going up in the Vietnam War and in the early 80s, but then we get the real 80s. This is exactly Ronald Reagan's Star Wars project. He said, if we cannot compete with the Soviets, that now they do have more nuclear missiles than us, let's destroy them in the space. The curious thing is that this technology that scared the Soviet Union and led communism to bankruptcy, state planning to bankruptcy, did not exist. We still do not have the technology from launching missiles and or laser rays from space, but he did push it. So these big expenditures here at the peak, the peak was not here in the early days of the Cold War, but the peak was exactly on the late 80s, early 90s. It was what caused the bankruptcy of the Soviet Union. The most interesting thing is not just that we see this military expanding here, when we see the next other effects, when we see these, this was the early stages of globalization. And then we can see here, 1992, so the year after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was only the United States. We were already in these unipolar world. But how was domestic economy in the United States? Well, here's the US GDP. We can see that it was falling. So, and why is it so? Reagan was elected in the early days of the 1980s, and he cut it exactly because he wanted to win the Soviets and he needed to expand on it. He cut it on social security, on education, on health, on youth programs. The result is here. The US economy was falling apart. So when we do have in 1992, the other thing that we do have right here is that unemployment was not in its maximum. So neoliberalism made a point, and I'm not being ideological here. I'm following Reagan and Thatcher's path. He did win the Soviets, but it starts to corrode itself as well. Neoliberalism starts to destroy itself and started to destroy a world that it was yet to create. What happened back then as well? Had a change in the White House. Reagan had been succeeded in '89 by his vice president, George H.W. Bush, also known as Bush father. But then the man that inherited all these crises of the early 90s, Bush Sr., the transformations that he had enabled him to have a second mandate. So what had happened? The smiling gentleman here called Bill Clinton won. And with a famous line that marked his campaign, it's the economy. I won't quote entirely, but it was basically it. Economy creates systems, economy destroys systems. This sentence, created by his senior political advisor and chairman of his campaign, James Carville, is what symbolized the America in those days. What's most interesting about it is that all these big push forward that the United States had given in the 1980s that led exactly to the destruction of the Soviet Union, these international America, at the moment that theoretically the Russians were needing them, they got back. So what we have is that, as many Russians quoted, they wanted jeans, pants, and access to rock and roll from the West. What they got were the ugly side of capitalism: starvation, hungry, and the cumulative of capital. What we do have is that, at the same time, industries that had started to leave the United States in mid-70s and in the mid-80s in Europe and had installed themselves, not only in China, but also in the other countries, the Asian tigers, were starting to give the first results. And on the other side of the world, some people were celebrating. This is the image of the first sale of a Coca-Cola, of the first Chinese factory of Coca-Cola. This image dates from 1983 in China. And by the early 90s, China was already the biggest exporter of Coca-Cola in the whole world, more than the United States itself. What happens is that in these unipolar worlds that we live in them, new agendas had surged. The climate agenda of the early days of the 1970s that had started with Stockholm Conference of '72, now were being internalized, nationalized. We do have here, for instance, an image of Brazil at the center of everything. We do have the ECO 1992. It's interesting to say that the Brazilian newspapers back then said that this conference was a fiasco, despite being the first one to hold in Brazil more than 50 world leaders. Back then, no one was exactly knowing how to deal with this new agenda, but it was already there. And some new figures started to surge. Many of them are famous faces because they are still around. They are not, for instance, dead, as the gentleman on the left, Mr. Berlusconi in Italy, but it's here where they are grown. The old leaders of the Cold War were no longer good. They still fought for another mentality. So it was time for new leadership. In an Italy that was being driven by financial capital, what best than put in power a prime minister than is actually a man from the business community? Mr. Berlusconi came in. Based on that fiasco of the capitalism in Russia, the Russians chose someone with a firm hand and elected Mr. Putin for the first time. So this is globalized economy. In this graphic, we can perfectly see what the world was going on. And we can see that with globalized economy, the world, independently if it is world economy as a whole, OECD, meaning developed countries, or emerging markets as a third, if we do have a crisis, everyone comes together. The interesting point is right here. For instance, in the late 90s, we have had the Asian crisis, we have had South American crisis, we have had the tech bubble in 2000, and we have had the Russian crisis in 1998, and many others. So emerging markets, everyone fall, but emerging markets were the ones that suffered the most. And you can see how OECD countries suffered, but not that much. At the same time, when we do have the triumph of the commodities boom in the early 2000s, we can see that developing countries, now no longer third world countries, we use already a new vocabulary. Developed countries are the ones that grew, in developing countries were the ones that grew the most. Developed countries, they kept growing, but not that much. Late 1990s, and the result of the globalization was also this. New technologies came in. Internet surged in 1992. Then we had Microsoft, Google, Oracle, and so many others that are still here present with us today. So these always developed in here. And then came the 2000s. These two images mark exactly what this period was, because it started exactly as this promise of these new bright words, technology, all these new events. But in the first year of the new century, a new war erupted. Now a war that we see no longer the enemy. It's not a state on the other side. It's not something that we can fight actually. It hides in the shadows. So we need to transform war. And by transforming war, there is a big cost. And this is the war on terror cost. This is only counting from 2001 to 2015. This is how much United States taxpayers paid for the wars on terror globally, Afghanistan, and Iraq. When we see the larger one, we can see that 2008 was the year that the war costed much. It's not a coincidence that in 2008, the world economy collapsed. And why is that so? Because you cannot pay for that much so long without having consequences. And one other interesting graphic that we can see, oil prices from 1940 to 2003. When we do see here is the first oil shock, 73, second oil shock, 79, prices keep kind of stable in the 80s, except by here. These one represents exactly the start of these movements. There was the Iran-Contras that moved some of the oil prices as well. But then let's go forward. 2008, we can see that we have had, 2003, exactly on the start of the war on terror, oil prices skyrocketed and they kept climbing until the climax, almost $200 per barrel. This is 2007, 2008. And then the system collapsed. At the same time, whilst old economies were good, were making progress, but some new countries, emerging ones, were appearing on the international scenario. We have here the initial ones of the BRICS, but we can also mention some others. And here's the impact of the rise of the emerging countries. We can see, for instance, the sands of Dubai. This image is 2000, this image is 2008. So in 8 years, they built a city in the desert. Brazilian passport. Brazilians didn't knew the word very much. Maybe Disneyland or something. These new growing economies Brazilians started traveling, but this applies to all other countries, developing ones as well. Tourists started to be a reality in countries where before only the very rich were able to travel, or if it was in the neighboring country. We have the Chinese boom. After having opened their economies in the mid-70s, the Chinese have thrived. It was not just the Coca-Cola before. They started to export other goods and build the mega cities. This one is an image of Shanghai. And the consequence that also enters in geopolitics, and it's very present these days, but back then nobody cared much, was that developing countries were buying soccer clubs, especially in Europe, and some basketball clubs in the United States. We do have, for instance, here, Russian money buying English teams and taking them to be the champions of Europe. How is the US economy? After all, we are talking about a world where the United States is reigning. It's unipolar power, this unipolar world. What do we have is this expansion. We do have the US economy from 2000 to 2008. And we can see that this is exactly the Afghanistan-Iraq invasions, 2001, 2003, and then the United States economy gets bigger. It collapses, it does not collapse, but falls a little bit in 2006, but then it came to 2008. And what is one of the explanations that we can credit these? Right on these other graphic. Growth of US private debt. As I mentioned before, this expansion and the cost of these wars have had an impact in the United States society. Anyone who has been to the United States between 2001 and 2008 could see that whilst two major wars were being fought in the Middle East, it seemed that nothing had changed at home because it was meant to be so. It was used and was to be shown that the United States had the power to fight two major conflicts without affecting the society. But what happened is that the expansion of this economy had a cost. We do see here households, it was the basis of the crisis, but then we see the non-financial business growing as well, and we see the financial businesses. All of these is leveraging. It was an economy based on leverage, meaning that despite being so strong, the result of Bretton Woods' destruction in 71 and 73 by President Richard Nixon came right here. Nixon famously quoted that you did not need a US dollar standard because the United States power was its bond. Collapsed here. They leveraged their economy. And what was the result of these 4 words? And then came the crisis. The crisis went much further than the US borders. The crisis became global. We can see here some of the European flags, because the most affected by these crises, as we had a globalized economy, were exactly the ones that was most linked with the United States economy, especially European Union and many of its states that had many investments in the United States. And those who are exactly here at the bottom are the ones who had the most fragile economies in Europe. And why is that so? Because at these moments, their economies, the substract of their economies, were not themselves, were not activities that they produced, but it was exactly the fact that they were linked, because they had made the miracle of a single currency and of a free trade space back in the 90s and early 2000s. But they suffered as well. And the other effects of the crisis were that the countries that, despite having economies linked to the United States and also to European Union economies, were more or so independent because of many factors, when were still developing countries, they started to grow more. In 2009, we have the formal creation of the BRIC bloc, now BRICS, and discussion on BRICS Plus. The basic ones that are exactly the countries that I showed in the other chart. Brazil, Russia, India, China. South Africa came right after. And what are the other effects? Well, we do need to think that many of these countries, especially when we do think on Asia and South America, their economies work in a different perspective than in Africa or Central America and the Caribbean. What happened from there on was that due to the aid packages that both the United States started applying to its own economy and the European Union to the member states of the bloc, refugee flows started to grow. It's a calculation as quoted in the National Geographic magazine in 2015. Refugees said, between living with $2 a day in the Sahel, a very dangerous region where I can plant, I can do anything, I'd rather go to Europe, where even if I have only a 20 euro salary a day, that's better than what I have here. So the old countries started to get even more attractive despite what they were passing on in their economies. We have had the big push because especially the so-called global north, but also the south, saw that the way that economy policies were being conducted, with industries still based on carbon demand, on an energetic perspective that was no longer present, was no longer due to what they wanted, was not possible. So we started to change this page, and climate activism became government policy, not as an activism, but as policy making. We do need to look at our climate. There's no other planet Earth. And the world started to embrace the idea of multilateralism. Why do I say so? Because exactly because of the coming up of new powers and the resurgence of old ones, the world started to see that not exactly sharing power, but that was needed to have more discussions. Other countries that were then not in the so-called big tables of negotiation. This is the image of the Pittsburgh G20 summit of 2009, the famous summit where then recently elected President Barack Obama turned to Brazilian President Lula and said, "You are the guy." This phrase can be interpreted in many ways, but it was basically being said so, that you are now on the table. How is it going to develop? It's something different. But the symbolism of these moments, considering that the G20 was a 1990s institution that now had come more to relevance, needed to be seen. What were the impacts of the effects of the crisis? Because those were the major effects of the crisis. Now we do have secondary impacts of them, derived from them. We can call them two, can name them exactly. First one was the ascent of the far right. And why is it so? What happened exactly? Many of the policies that were being taken here were a sort of reshape of the social democracy policies of the post-World War II, but still with a neoliberal facade. They were defined, but they didn't make a point to everybody. So for instance, let me get to one specific topic, an example. We go and speak with someone from the agro community in Europe these days, independently if their government is pro or against the EU, but they are unhappy at these moments because they see that the taxes practiced by the states are too high for them. So what do? They try and go and vote for something that's different. This is in the global north. We come to Argentina, and given that the traditional Peronists, the neoliberals, or the declared left has failed to conduct the economy, they go right. So the right that was banned of the world after World War II, that was seen it's ugly, it's bad, it caused this big war, it became attractive again. And the results cannot be denied. We see all over the world, except in Asia, one or two countries can be defined as, but let's say the Western world or Western societies, that the far right has had an ascent. And the second element, therefore, I started my presentation talking about tectonic moves, is that whenever you move too much, too fast, the obvious consequence that you have, it's war, especially if it is a clash of big countries, central ones. And focusing on economy, what do we have from here? We do have that military expenditure once again started to grow. We can see on the first charter, right here, this is 2001. So it had grown a little bit with the start of the war on terror, but the war on terror brings a perspective. We need one technology, the second, troops, soldiers that are very well trained, very well focused. Let's call them special forces. We need these two. So despite I have this expansion on my expenditure, it's not that much. And then there is a falling. Come 2009, go 2012, gets more or less 2014. Change of paradigm. Have Russian annexation of Crimea, and also on the other side of the world, the Chinese, before flexing their muscles in Taiwan, they started to absorb more of Hong Kong. Not exactly breaking, but making their own interpretation of many of the clauses of the delivering of Hong Kong of 1997. So what the world sees is that those old good days of peace that never actually came, they were now really dead. So the world starts to expand more. Because what do we see in both of these cases and in many others? Because conflicts in the Middle East start to all pop up. The United States had left Iraq in 2009, but then then you see the decrease, but then they went back in 2013, 14 because of Islamic State. Crises all over Africa, mostly based on terrorism, but now starting some coups. So the world starts to get hot again. And this time, it's not just technology, despite technology be a pivotal effect and having a pivotal effect on it. This time, what do we really have here is that we need manpower and munitions. War becomes global again. Scale becomes global. And it remembers a scenario 100 years earlier. When we go to 1870s until the start of the Great War, we can see that we had started to increase military expenditures all over. And then we, of course, still have the United States as being uncontestably the country that most expends on defense. We do have this chart from 2022, and we can see that the two countries that directly compete for global supremacy are number 1 and number 2. Number 3 is a country that's in war. Number 4 is a country with very tense borders. And number 5 is a country that has regional pretensions. And the others are traditional expandings. We do have United Kingdom and Germany, United Kingdom, Germany and France, some of the protagonists of World War II that kept their way ahead of world as being world powers in the after war, even when Germany came back in the 1950s. South Korea is a very specific situation because of its tense border. Japan starts to rearm itself, first time since World War II. And then we have Ukraine. Not only then we have Italy. But look the discrepancy that we have on these data. These are the solid dates of 2022. The war in Ukraine was already of almost a year of it. The United States is the sole producer of weapons in the world. A country directly involved in the conflict is the third. A country in which the war is fought on its borders. It's right here. So there's something weird right here. And what were the other effects? Oh, the other effects were that new diseases started to surge. And why is it so? Because the old treatments with the globalized population, more than 8 billion people, were not in effect anymore. And many of them did not believe in traditional science. And the second came with digitalization and the AI. All that tech boom of the late 90s, early 2000s now starts to develop itself, going further in it. But what comes together? Something that had already been seen in the 1990s, unemployment. Societies these days, they do struggle. And this is one of the greatest concerns, both of left and right. So what are we going to do with a mass of people that are unemployed? This is a preoccupation in the global north. Imagine in a country like Brazil, which we do have a very high mass of the population that it is unskilled. And these days, we do have another problem. Education, that in the past was an insurance that you had that you would get a good job. These days does not mean that anymore. If you do not owe a PhD, it's very hard to get yourself in the market, not only private, but public as well. So these are some of the challenges that are coming. Other effect is the increase in the drug consumption. As same as in the 1930s, we have had the skyrocketing consumption of drugs because of the crisis of 1929, after the 2008 crisis, and all of the problems of the 2010s and early 2020s, it is rational to assume that people are going to start looking for, let's say, something to get them around. In popular culture, a way to get high, to get away from the problems. And what we do have is that South America, still one of the epicenters of drug production in the world. The other one's right here, the Golden Triangle, 2 golden triangles in Asia, and then all the routes. But what's most interesting is that we do have is that now Europe became the epicenter of drug consumption. For instance, in the cocaine trade, you do have the stabilization of the North American markets, not the decrease, the stabilization of cocaine consumption, and the increase of meth, crystal meth, and opium. The opium, this problem with opioids that's raveling American society, be them legal or not, it's very high. But for instance, today, sorry for the vocabulary I'm going to use, but the commodity that's most counterfeited in the US border is no longer drugs, it's people. People became an asset. The people trade became once again an asset. And in Europe, what you have is that with so many problems and the war back on their borders, cocaine consumption got even higher. And then these pressures, societies and governments even more, because of these, social security is also pressured. Health systems are under pressure. The whole economy is under pressure. And you do have many challenges for democracy. Because if people, independently where they are on the political spectrum, stop believing in democracy, talking in the Western perspective, after all, most of all, actually. If people stop believing in democracy, you stop believing on the basis of the system that it was founded. You stop believing in what Greek philosophers developed more than 3,000 years ago. You stop believing in the liberal revolutions of the 18th and 19th century. You stop believing in all the principles that led the world and led to the creation of the UN Charter in 1944-45. You stop believing in it. So it corrodes the system on the inside. So, get into our final considerations. First one is that in 1989, the year where we tear down the Berlin Wall, we would have approximately 7 walls. These days, we have more than 70 constructed and under construction. 1989, the last phase of the Cold War, we had around 50 armed conflicts in the world. Remembering that the Soviets had withdrawn from Afghanistan that same year and that the Vietnam had ended the decade before. So there were more smaller ones, localized. Central America, some in Africa, like resurgences in the Rhodesia transition to Zimbabwe, and so on. One in Northern Asia, but still known in Europe. We would have in the 1990s with the dissolution of Yugoslavia. But then we have nothing. Today, there are 110 in progress. It was recently came to public by CIPRI, an institution, Stockholm Institution of Political and International Affairs Research, that 2023 was the year with most deaths by conflict in the world since 1945. So we are on the peak of these global transformations, and war is in the center of the thing. So where are we? We are in a new Cold War? No. First time that I heard this expression was in Columbia University, 2008. And this is something very common, 2018. And this is something very common in United States politics to say that they are in the second Cold War, now against China. But that's not the truth, and it's not me who's saying. You can ask all the countries in the G20, and they would deny that we are in the second Cold War. And why is that so? The Cold War, the real one against the Soviets, United States against Soviet Union, had only two major superpowers. All of the others were in one side or the other. Now we do have other countries that choose to be non-aligned with none of these. And despite the United States and China being the stronger ones in these contender, there are other perspectives. So where are we? We are in a multipolar world. As French president quoted, the great risk, he speaks specifically of Europe, but this can apply to many other countries. The great risk Europe faces is that it gets caught up in the crises that are not ours, which prevents it from building its strategic autonomy. What many countries seek these days is that they exactly can be linked, because we need to be. The world cannot deglobalize itself. That won't happen. Despite all the conspiracy theories, the world will not deglobalize. But being globalized does not mean that we need to obey to a side or the other. So what is yet to come? We are already in a movement, and when I say we, it's not just Brazil or BRICS or Latin America, but this is the words of letting the dependency on the US dollar away. Countries are each time making more transactions on the national currencies than with US dollars. In 2023, Brazil and China signed a global trade agreement stating that by 2026, 50% of their economy would be linked in direct national currencies, being Brazilian real and the Chinese renminbi. This is to quote just one example. But this is happening all over the world. Another one is that these days, Saudi Arabia, to sell petroleum to the United States, is not wanting US dollars anymore. Saudis are asking for either the euro or the Chinese renminbi. So what do we have is that countries that are becoming regional, even if they are just regional, but powers on their states, they're saying no to the dollar. Professor, are you saying that the dollar is dead? No. Same as when the Great Britain pound left and gave space to the dollar after Bretton Woods, it is not dead. But the opposite, it's very valuable. But we are already seeing a currency transition. And other examples is that what is yet to come, and these I leave to the audience, and one of the things that's going to be debated on these workshops is exactly this new transition that we are. A new financial order. We are going from Bretton Woods to the needs led by Europe, South America, and some Middle East countries of this new world currency. And here's a picture of the coming to Brazil on August the 1st, 2023 of United Nations Deputy General Secretary, Madam Amina Mohammed, where she said that this initiative is 100% backed by the United Nations. So the world on many spectrums is already discussing what is yet to come. And this is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricardo, for the interesting presentation. I appreciate the particular perspective for analyzing the current crisis, the ecological crisis, but also the war. So I leave the floor to...
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Ricardo, for interesting and excellent presentation. I love it. And I would like to combine some of the topics you have been in your presentation. Just have a few questions to start the debate. This question is about thinking about, don't worry, don't suffer about this, because this question is probably my concerns about this theme. So I will take advantage in your presentation. My first question is, your presentation, the mention of wars or war expanding. This term highlights armed conflicts occurring in various parts of the world. My question is, how are these conflicts interconnected with other crises, such as a climate crisis or research shortages? What the humanitarian and political implication of this conflict is? Because you said there are new diseases, unemployment, this is new concerns. So could you elaborate of this point further? I think we can go one by one. Question.
So thank you very much. We need to see that wars, independent of where they are always interconnected. They are facts that deepen themselves in many parts of the world. So I'm going to give one example. When we look, for instance, see the Houthis in Yemen, this crisis called the attention of the media in 2023 because the Houthis were striking merchant ships that they considered to be of countries of Israel or aligned countries with Israel in the recent Gaza emergency. But these crises did not start today. We need to understand two things, that there has been fought a proxy war in Yemen these days. Houthis are only one of the sides. But why Yemen? Yemen is a small country enclaved in the Arabic Peninsula and is the poorest country in the region. So there you have one of the things. Yemen does not hold what the neighbors like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, or many are, or even another to compare with a small country, Oman, do have. That's oil. Yemen does have oil, but not that much. It is in a privileged position due to being a strategic place for global trade that is exactly the route right after Suez. But the country is extremely poor. So we do have the first reason here. We do not have numbers of COVID in there, but we do know that it decimated a lot of people. So you have an entire generation that, since these conflicts have been fought for more than 12 years now, started the way, the perspective as it is with the Arab revolt of 2011. And we're speaking of 12 years, but there were already internal problems previous to it. So you can say that a young man of around 15 years old in Yemen in 2024, someone who has already the age to fire a rifle, and they do, has had the stolen childhood, had no perspective. So these is interconnected. Problems, they do not just come up from light today. We do need to see, for instance, to look to Europe, the place where you still have, now with the Ukraine conflict, it's changing a little bit. But until a couple of years ago, one of the places that was the epicenter of weapons trade in Europe was Serbia and Montenegro, separated, not as only one country, the two countries. Why is that so? These are two of the most affected nations of the war, of the Yugoslavian wars of the 1990s. That actually, whilst others like Croatia and Slovenia recovered, these hadn't completely recovered. So problems, when they are not resolved, they come from time to time. So we do have the consequence, sometimes, as the second example, of old wars resurging in new conflicts, or as it is in the case of Yemen, natural disaster, poor population, diseases, all that lead to the fact that that region be the precise scenario for some conflicts.
Excellent. Thank you for clear answer. And you said in your presentation the new role of the developed countries. My second question is about this. So, in your opinion, what is the role of the geopolitics in avoiding conflicts, systemic crisis, systemic and climate disasters, now including developing countries at the table?
We need to see that the crises, they are here to come. The great thing is that world leaders, politicians, policymakers, we can name the way we prefer. They need to see one thing, and here I'm going to quote Churchill. Leaders are not tested when the situation is all right. Leaders are tested in crisis. So how you respond to it and what comes after if you do not create a bigger problem is what's going to measure who you are or where you're driven, where you're driving your society. The word has dramatically changed, and this is exactly my initial quote. One of the things that we do need to see is that we are going to keep changing, but we need to be against these changes, or can we control and drive these changes?
As I agree with you. So my final question is, because you said in your presentation about the systemic crisis. So this term alludes to crises that affect the entire system, such as the global crisis of 2008. I would like let's know what your opinion about the role of the global institution play in the management of this crisis, how the systemic crisis impact different regions and social groups. And you have anything different now?
Well, what we can see is that we have two perspectives here. The first one about global institutions acting on it. If it was not the old global institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, Bretton Woods institutions, the crisis would have been much worse, no doubt. And of course, we cannot mention Europe without speaking of the European Central Bank and of the then its chief, Signor Mario Draghi, who was the man responsible these days, and this is something recognized in Europe, to keep it alive. Without Draghi saying that he would buy the bad bonds as many as they were, there would be no European Union in 2024 to speak of. But what we do need to see as well is that new political and economic institutions came from this. We do have, for instance, the BRICS Bank, popularly known, but formerly known as NDB, Chinese investing in a lot of multinational institutions, especially finance ones. And we do need to see as well that local institutions were able to counter the effects. There is, for instance, a famous line between President Lula and then President Barack Obama, where President Obama asked President Lula, this is in his biography, by the way, he asked, how could you counter the effects of the crisis in Brazil? And he said, I have public banks. And President Obama said, how so? Then he spoke about what we know as Banco do Brasil, BNDES, Caixa Econômica, and so on, and said, that's fantastic. I don't have these instruments here. And after that, the United States government, via the United States Treasury, started buying shares of the Bank of America. These days, the United States government owes more than 53% of Bank of America. So it had also an impact on the head of the policymakers in countries that had, let's say, already resolved themselves.
Thank you, Ricardo. These are my questions. I learning a lot and appreciate this opportunity. So thank you. Thank you, Orero, for inviting me, and I give back the word to Chiara.
How we can control them?
Difficult to say how we can control, but what we cannot do is keep on the rhythm that we are. For instance, United Nations. United Nations has had one pivotal role after World War II. UN, and this is not me saying, it's current General Secretary, Mr. Guterres, has said that the United Nations has failed in many ways. But one thing the UN did not fail, to prevent World War III. But in the pace that we are going, it is something to be asked. How long more will it be able to counter it? So trust in the institutions. This is something more myself speaking than some institution. But trust in the institutions And reforming the system, not destroying it, is a path that we can follow.
We can open for questions. Someone? Questions from the floor? No? Can finish the... Oh, there is a question.
I want to say a pleasant evening to you all. Professor Ricardo, I really enjoy your lecture. Very important lecture that every citizen should attend. Global problem today, the war in the world today is terrible. And we need to know the way forward. What is the way forward? How do we tackle this? So happy that country I am here, Brazil, did not dive itself into that kind of war. I love the government of Brazil for that. Professor, what is the way forward for this? How can the world tackle this war all over in Africa, North America, South America, everywhere in the world? How do we tackle it?
Thank you very much, Mr. Ibrahim. Now, I believe that stopping wars is something very difficult. Tackle them whole. I want to be a pessimist. I'm being very realistic here. Stopping wars is something difficult. But on the face of conflicts that we do are, war cannot be something to be traded off. Of course, countries need to expand and defense, but focusing the foreign policy only in defense, it will strike exactly to more conflicts. When we have in the 1950s, the changing right after in some countries, 47, 48, World War II, the name of ministries from Ministry of War to Ministry of Defense was already based on the perspective that we do need to have a policy based in our defense, not in war, the act of aggression. I think is that many people have forgotten about this. What we do need is to recover this perspective that wars are going to happen. There's some way of avoiding that they escalate. There's some way of preventing more of them, but how to stop, I really don't believe it's possible. But we do need to recover the perspective of not attacking first, because if one does not attack the other first, then there'll be no conflict.
I have another questions. So you are talking about war, but I want to conclude in more optimistic way. So my question is, how can we promote more integrating collaborative approach to address contemporary changelings? And Ricardo, in your opinion, what are the examples of successful initiatives in this regard?
We need to make people believe once again that cooperation is the best achievement that we can have. I think, and we have some European colleagues in the audience here today, that European Common Market was the pinnacle of it. For me, the European Union, especially in its old standards, let's not talk about the recent reforms, not after 2013, but let's say, especially since Schengen, with the free space to trade in goods, and then with the euro in 1999 and 2000, this was a huge success. When it starts, actually, who would say that after more than 200 years of direct rivalry that led to 3 wars, not just the first and the second, but also the Franco-Prussian War, France and Germany would be on the same side of the table, signing an economic pact. that would bring integration, that would help in developing new technologies, peaceful ones also, that would help in health institutions, and that would bring together societies. Yesterday, I was reading, I want to deepen my reading on this new report. That's exactly the consequences. The report isn't, there's another name, but the consequences of Schengen 30. So what happens after these 30 years of integration and what is yet to come? And I believe that if we can push these blocks to integrate more instead of getting themselves more separated, we do have, for instance, here, not just to speak of Europe, but Mercosur. Mercosur was something fantastic, a big South American integration based exactly on this European model, of course, with particularities to the continent. If we could back to these, when we think that in 2024, the Americas were more integrated when the Incas ruled all of the Pacific, or when the Spanish and Portuguese crowns were together in the 17th century than these days, sorry the word, but it's an absurd. So we do need to back to this integration and making people understand that cooperating is better than fighting.
Thank you. Seminar. And I was interested in hearing more about your perceptions on the polar world versus the unipolar world. As you can see that the US still has a lot of influences.
Thank you. Well, the multipolar world is already a reality. The way that it's taken, that's what's most complicated, because it's exactly when we do have these many poles of power, there is these shocks, because everyone wants to be the one. And then it goes to the colleague here, question on the collaboration. The fact is that, and I was having a discussion during our lunch today with Professor Ocampo, who was the key lecturer this morning. And Professor Ocampo is a Columbia fellow, and I asked him about how does the United States society sees the changes that are coming these days. And his answer was most in line with what some other American, he's Colombian, but lives and teaches in the United States. And his answer was aligned with somewhat another American colleagues had already told me. The US establishment already knows that the American world is over. But the same as the British knew that their colonial world was over after World War II, it takes a couple of decades until the society itself assimilates it. So I do believe that we are on this path, that once, it's interesting because once in the same university, a professor, he was a Brazilian, had made his PhD in Germany, and he said something that I carry very much on me, that you know that a superpower knows that it's changing when you do start having books on the bookshops about former empires that fell. So he said that when he was young and studied in Germany, had traveled to the United Kingdom. It was a bit after the Falklands War, and he used to see in British bookshops the ascent and fall of great powers, the end of the Roman Empire. How has Rome died? And he said that in a recent travel that he had made, this was about 10 years ago, actually. He said that he had seen the same in United States bookshops, and these days there are even more so in it. So we are in this phase of transition.
Questions? Thank you, Riccardo and Fabrizio, for the interesting discussion and for your beautiful presentation. We can conclude the first special session.
For the presence of all people here. Tomorrow we will have here two ordinary sections. Thank you.
Thank you.